This week, one man's monumental decision and an age-old debate that could shift the course of history.
We have breaking news here. President Biden has announced he will stand down.
Joe Biden has said that he is going to stand down from the presidential race.
US President Joe Biden has officially dropped out of the presidential race late on a Sunday night. Mounting speculation and doubts about his ability to win against Trump, increasingly shaky public performances, and the apathy he inspired among young voters finally forced his hand.
In an instant, the old era is over and the new era is here. It is go time.
Showing once and for all that in this election, age isn't just a number. It's a game changer in more ways than one. Two major voting groups, millennials and Gen Zs, finally have the numbers to influence political outcomes. The problem is, more and more young people around the world are asking the same question. If democracy is supposed to be so good, why does it feel so bad? They're living through the consequences of short-sighted policy choices made before they had a say. And more are now choosing extreme candidates to answer the questions of their age. So what got us here?
Our message to millennials, speaking as one myself. Our government sold us a false bill of goods with the Iraq War and the 2008 financial crisis.
And can democracy still offer young people a path to a better future?
What up, America? If you're ready for President Trump to take the stage, I need everybody to stand up. Say fight, fight. Say fight, fight.
From the lands of the Kulin Nation, I'm Emma Hoy. You're listening to Leave It to the Experts. We're now halfway through this mega make-or-break year for democracy. By year's end, more than half the world's population will have gone to the polls, from democratic giants like India and the United States to smaller fledgling democracies like Maldives and Bangladesh. The choices made this year will shape the global landscape for decades. As new leaders emerge and old systems are tested, democratic and institutional fault lines are being exposed, and our future hangs in the balance. To complicate matters even more, many voters around the world have or will go to the polls in the midst of a cost of living crisis. And yet, there's more money around now than ever before.
And the options market is booming with the most action it has seen in at least 50 years. That is according to an analysis done by...
Cheers and applause all round, look. In New York, the S&P 500 closing on a record high. It's now up 35% since that low.
The US economy is booming, with Wall Street hitting record highs and property prices soaring. During the pandemic, a new billionaire was minted every single day, and the 10 richest men in the world doubled their fortunes. But that's the thing. That wealth didn't really spread beyond those that were already rich before COVID came to town. To keep things afloat as the pandemic shut the world down, central banks injected economies with cheap money, which major companies then used not to invest in jobs or the future, but to boost their own stock prices. Companies like Qantas bought back their own shares, driving up profits, but angering staff who were laid off during the pandemic.
They also object to the company's plan to increase a share buyback program. Unions say sacked workers were told Qantas needed to save money.
As the pandemic fades and economic conditions have shifted, the money that was pumped into businesses to prop up our economies continues to have unexpected effects on our daily lives. Take the United States, for example. In 2020, the US stock market dropped by 30%, and 10 million people lost their jobs. Just 4 years later, in 2024, the US economy is booming. It's leading all advanced nations with a strong job market, soaring stocks, and controlled inflation. But dig a little deeper, and it's clear that huge segments of the community are actually doing it much tougher than ever before.
The American economy looks strong, but many people are not feeling the positive vibes.
With half of all renters paying more than 30% of their income on rent and utilities.
The policy choices made during the pandemic may have kept economies afloat while boosting stock markets and corporate profits, but they also worsened wealth inequality, drove up housing costs, and contributed to inflation. The delicate balance between the interests of business, government, and society seems increasingly out of whack, and those bearing the brunt of it are young people.
In the US, for the first time in our 275-year history, a 30-year-old man or woman isn't doing as well as his or her parents economically. And that may not sound like a big deal, but I think that's essentially the social compact breaking. And it creates rage and shame.
A report in the American Journal of Sociology says that the average millennial now has 30% less wealth at the age of 35 than baby boomers did at the same age. And that their successors, Gen Zs, are earning less and have more debt than millennials did at their age. In other words, we're headed in the wrong direction. And the kids are not all right. In 2021, a large Australian study found around 42% of people aged 15 to 24 were psychologically distressed, up from 18% in 2011. In the United States, young adults went from among the most satisfied citizens in the country to the least within the last 20 years. So what's going on with kids these days? Why are their experiences and life satisfaction contrasting so sharply with those of past generations? And more importantly, can we get through a whole debate about generational gaps without mentioning avocados? Let's ask Dr. David Blunt, lecturer in international relations at the University of Sydney and a fellow of the Ethics Centre. Dr. Blunt, welcome to Leave It to the Experts. Now, there's been a lot of discussion about the intergenerational warfare between millennials and Gen Zs and then their parents and older generations. And this divide is becoming more and more evident at the ballot box. We're seeing young people increasingly turning away from traditional politics or voting for more extreme candidates. Why do you think that is?
Well, you have to look at what young people are going to be getting out of society, right? One of the things that we might say is that the intergenerational social contract is breaking down. Let's take the boomer generation, for example. When they went to university, it was largely free. Jobs were plentiful. When you got a job, it could be basically for life. There would be a pension at the end of your career, which was probably a defined benefit pension rather than a defined contribution pension, which means you would get a fixed amount of money every year indexed to inflation for the rest of your life. I can speak to several members of this generation, my parents' generation, who took retirement in their mid-50s and have been living a very good life, comfortable life ever since. Now, when I think about my generation, I would probably be described as millennial, generously. My cohort, some of my friends own homes. A lot of them don't. A lot of them do not have pensions. Salaries have not kept pace with inflation. Indeed, salaries in terms of real income have stagnated at least since 2008, probably since the beginning of the 21st century. And that's been offset by the increase of cheap goods brought in from overseas. But of course, these cheap goods brought in from overseas have come at the cost of solid jobs in the industrial base, leaving the rust belts in places like the United States, in Great Britain, in France, and to a lesser extent in Germany. These are secure, unionized, stable jobs that have gone away. Now, that's just my generation. I mean, millennials are kind of okay. When we look at Gen Z or Gen Z, we're talking about a generation that's even more precarious, spending an absolute fortune on education with relatively little job security afterwards, to say nothing of the pension time bomb for them down the line. So there is a big divide between these generations in terms of what opportunities society has provided them. And we can say that the older generation received a much better deal than the younger generations. And we might also say the older generation simply isn't paying their way. When we look at what gets taxed, work gets taxed, what you work at your job, your income tax, but wealth doesn't really get taxed in the same way. So you have a large number of older people sitting on a huge amount of wealth that is not being used for the public good. And we might say that is not particularly fair.
How much blame for all of this can we place at the feet of the political parties and the candidates themselves? Is it something that they need to be changing, or is this just symptomatic of a broader societal shift?
That's a hard question to answer. I mean, there are large systemic forces at play. But one of the things that we would expect from our politicians is the ability to adapt and change to changing circumstances. But there seems to be, I guess, a deep reticence against radical change. I mean, think about the housing crisis, for example. We know that there is a housing shortage in Australia, in the United States, in Canada, in Great Britain, basically across the Western world, there is a housing crisis. Why isn't anything being done? Well, the fact of the matter is, so much money is tied up in housing that any Democratic politician who comes out and says, I'm going to do something that is basically going to burst the property bubble is going to lose, right? Because it's sort of like a confidence trick that everyone's bought into, right? If your house is worth, I don't know, $2 million, you are not going to vote for someone who is going to drop it back down to what you bought it for 20 years ago, right? Which was probably $300,000. No one will vote for that. So politicians are constrained by democratic constraints, right? Young people cannot carry an election, nor should they. No generation, no cohort should be dictating to the other cohorts in a society, right? That's not how democracy works. There needs to be compromise. But the thing that young people can probably say is that, well, it's not that we aren't trying to control everything. It's just we're not getting anything out of this. We're not getting any of the chances that our older generations have. So why should we be enchanted, or why should we adhere to this system? So I do have some sympathy for our politicians. They're in a tight scrap, but there seems to be just a dearth of creative responses. Everyone seems to be hoping that they can kick these problems into the long grass and it will be the next guy's problem, right? And that is an unfortunate flaw of the democratic system where at best you think about the next election cycle. You don't think 20 years down the road.
So we have these huge forces at play. We've got, the lack of pensions, stagnating wages, the collapse of traditional industries, and, the structure of our taxation system. And as a result, there's this growing feeling of detachment from many young people from the political process. A lot of them that we speak to believe that democracy no longer offers them a positive vision for their future. So do you agree with the sentiment that today's political systems just aren't addressing the hopes and needs of younger generations?
Yeah, look, increasingly our political systems in the West are looking very sclerotic, right? They are not doing what they're supposed to be doing, which is providing people with a reasonably good chance at a vision of a good life. They seem to be biased towards older generations and to wealthier members of society. There's certainly concerns about the capture of democratic institutions by wealthy donors. If you look in the United States, the Citizens United judgment by the Supreme Court in the early 2000s set the stage for an unparalleled amount of money being poured into American politics. Just look at this week, Elon Musk has promised, I think, to give $45 million a week to the Trump campaign, or a month to the Trump campaign. This might say, well, if you have these donors giving so much money, are they really going to listen to young people who do not have the amount of influence that a billionaire does? So we can see perhaps people are becoming disenchanted with the system. And it might also go some way to explaining why there is a rise in interest towards radical alternatives, both on the left and the right in democracy, where we're saying this isn't working, the status quo doesn't work. If the status quo doesn't work, here's an attractive solution. The problem with these solutions, and your viewers can't see this, but there's sort of big air quotes around them, listeners, right, not viewers, is that they're often very simplistic. They're often very disingenuous. They have a truth-y feel to them, but they in fact do not reflect reality, right? They're an easy solution. So we can think about, say, anti-immigration rhetoric, for example. It blames everything on foreigners coming in and taking your jobs and taking your housing. Well, that is often not reflected in the facts, but people feel that it's good. And that's what I worry about, is that a lot of people, they become disillusioned, they become disenchanted, but they aren't really buying into the facts. They're buying into convenient narratives.
Coming back to Donald Trump, we've seen, obviously, over recent days, the impact that an angry, disillusioned young person with a gun can have on something as seismic as the US presidential race. So do you think that political violence from younger voters who feel increasingly powerless is a growing concern?
Yes. I mean, I think it's probably true. If you look at history, when you find large levels of young people suffering from unemployment or suffering disillusion with political systems, feeling alienated from society, like they don't have a place, especially when we're talking about young men. I mean, it's men are the ones who do violence. It's just simply the facts. Things happen. Bad things happen. If you look at, Tsarist Russia, the rise in anarchist assassinations in the 19th century. If you look at there's almost too many examples to point to, but when you get a lot of dispossessed younger men, this is when trouble starts happening. And this fuels the crisis of masculinity narrative that's happening in a lot of Western countries. The changes that have happened in Western society over the past 50 years, which, are obviously for the best. I mean, the idea that we can go back to a 1950s patriarchy is not appealing to really anyone, but certainly not to women. That's not going to happen. But, we see who are the voices of men right now. It's people like Andrew Tate, who are just these wretched, moronic misogynists. And you kind of think, what are we offering young men as an actual vision of being a good person in society? And it seems that there's just a gap there, right? And it's being filled by these sort of, as I say, your Andrew Tate characters, your neo-fascists, people who are not really people who you should give the time of day to, yet they have millions of followers. It's deeply disturbing.
We'll be right back.
Hi, my name is Andrew Jaspin, and I'm the founding editor and director of 360 Info. At 360 Info, we're providing evidence-driven, solution-based journalism, all written by leading experts. Every week, we release new and innovative news content that bridges the gap between the world's brightest minds and the global public. To be part of the fight against misinformation, sign up for our newsletters and follow us on social media, or head to 360info.org. If you're a journalist or a publisher or editor, you can sign up for our Newswire service, which is free of charge at newshub.360info.org.
The economic upheaval currently being experienced by younger generations didn't begin with the COVID pandemic.
Not in generations has Wall Street absorbed the number of body blows it took today.
The American financial system is rocked to its foundation.
Between 2007 and 2009, the world experienced one of the most severe economic downturns in modern history, comparable to the Great Depression of the 1930s. The global financial crisis, or GFC, was triggered by the collapse of the US housing bubble, when risky subprime mortgages or home loans given to borrowers with poor credit began to default at alarming rates, leading to the collapse of major financial institutions, a severe credit crunch, and a sharp decline in global stock markets. As banks failed and credit dried up, economies worldwide contracted, causing widespread job losses and a deep recession. Households headed by those in their 20s were the hardest hit at the time, and many of those same young people are still feeling the impacts today. In 2018, management professor Peter Capaldi argued that the GFC was the key reason why young people continue to delay buying houses, having children, and other markers of a stable adult life. And yet, despite the economic turmoil, in the late 2000s, there was a real sense that the winds of change had come, driven by something you don't see all that much in politics these days: hope.
I will be Prime Minister for all Australians.
If there is anyone out there who still doubts that America is a place where all things are possible, tonight is your answer.
At the close of the 2000s, there was a palpable sense of hope in politics. That globally, at least for the moment, the election of the first Black US president, charismatic Barack Obama, felt like a quantum leap forward for progressives. In the UK, Tony Blair stepped aside after 10 years as Prime Minister in favour of Gordon Brown, a move many hoped would reinvigorate the Labor Party and renew its appeal to voters. While in Australia, Kevin Rudd's campaign, powered by social media and a grand vision for the future, ended 11 years of Conservative government and energised the next generation. So while the economy fell apart and the housing market collapsed, there was at least a sense that the West had new leaders, big ideas, and many still had faith that their votes could impact meaningful change. But the baggage accrued by the war on terror began to weigh heavily on a public increasingly feeling like they'd been lied to.
That didn't last long. Almost everything that had been used to justify the war turned out to be a lie, including how quick it was supposed to be.
As progressive leaders like Obama and Rudd promised to close Guantanamo Bay and end the Iraq War, they tapped into a widespread desire to escape from the bloody conflicts of the previous decades. But their failure to act decisively and to shift focus from these old conflicts in order to address future challenges left Western societies struggling amid the economic fallout from the global financial crisis. Compounding this frustration was the perception that those responsible for the GFC had largely evaded accountability, while young people and the poor continued to bear the brunt of its consequences. Little wonder that by 2024, leaders now struggle to generate meaningful optimism with young people.
Meet our new Prime Minister. Yes, it's 50 Shades of Beige, Captain Whitebread, Sir Keir Starmer.
Young people do not care about democracy. They don't believe in democracy anymore.
Young people today are grappling with a social contract repeatedly shattered before they reached voting age. The economic systems and power structures driving our world are having profound impacts on the future of democracy, and in some countries, the very survival of communities. The birth rate in most countries has fallen, in part because the generations who would usually be starting families are facing steeper financial hurdles and an increasingly uncertain future. The decline will have a snowball effect as populations age, with the shrinking workforce struggling to support a growing number of retirees.
Not a lot of us are voting right now, and it's so important to have the youth voice while to be represented in voting.
The two options aren't very timely. They don't really align with a lot of what our generation feels.
With a growing mass of people, perhaps unsurprisingly, unhappy with the status quo, they've become increasingly vulnerable to strong messaging from politicians who claim to have simple answers to very complicated problems. It's creating challenges across all facets of society and shaking the very foundation of our democratic societies: trust. To speak more on that, let's welcome back Dr. David Blunt.
Many believe that the roots of this generation's political apathy can be largely traced back to 2008 and the global financial crisis, which it wasn't felt as keenly in Australia as it was in many other parts of the world, but certainly it was felt by many that it had broken the social contract between politics, business, and young people. Do you agree that that was the crucial moment that really kicked off this story, or do you think it's part of a much larger narrative?
I think, 2008 was a big turning point, right? It really shook the world's economy. But 2008 was coming, right? It had been coming for a long time. It is the result of the post-Cold War consensus, the neoliberal consensus that pulled the state out of a lot of the sectors that had traditionally been managing after the Second World War. Let the market decide, let the market sort of run fairly deregulated. And these were the chickens coming home to roost. It also is sort of the result of things like, offshoring of manufacturing, the results of globalization, which have been good in a lot of ways, right? An interlinked global economy has produced a great amount of wealth. The problem is that wealth has become very centralized in a relatively small number of the population. Now, a lot of people hoped that would change in 2008, but it seemed to just double down, right? The rich have gotten richer, the poor have gotten poorer, at least in the global north, in places like Australia and the United States. In other parts of the world, there have been sort of growth for a global middle class, places like China and India. But, that is not being universal across the board. And solutions just have not been forthcoming. I mean, really what government has done is say, let's, try to stabilize things, large amount of quantitative easing, cheap loans for people so they can then afford unaffordable mortgages. And then when you have a flutter in mortgage or in interest rates, which affect mortgage rates, you get a lot of people realizing that they've been building their, house on sand for all intents and purposes, fiscal sand. This can be traced back to 2008, but it is part of a larger trend of neoliberalism that has taken root really since the 1980s, right? This is Reagan's voodoo economics that has gotten brought in, this idea that, if you give tax cuts to the wealthy, if you let the markets decide, then eventually more wealth will be created and will all trickle down to the rest of us. But the fact of the matter is there's no trickling. It's just a big reservoir of wealth controlled by a small amount of people. And progressive taxation is what used to solve that, but we've been unwilling to do that, at least when it comes to wealth.
On the idea of, the neoliberal project, last episode, we had Associate Professor Ben Balitz from Monash coming on the show and saying that the neoliberal project of wealth creation and economic growth that, as you said, was really spearheaded through the 80s, 90s and 2000s now looks like it might be shifting and potentially ending in favor of something else. If that's true, what is going to replace it? And what does it take for young people in countries like Australia to implement a new vision for their future if they feel like they don't have the power to impact change now?
I mean, that's a big question. I mean, what will replace neoliberalism? I don't know, is the honest answer to that. I mean, some might say something worse is going to replace neoliberalism. Certainly, colleagues like Yanis Varoufakis have said that, we're entering an age of techno-feudalism in which we are going to be sort of, for all intents and purposes, serfs for platform feudal overlords like your Amazons and your eBays and your social media platforms, and we will sort of make our money by paying them sort of a rent. We might say that it could be the beginning of a new age of socialism, right? Perhaps people will start looking at anti-capitalist or post-capitalist alternatives where there's greater wealth distribution. But the fact of the matter is there's no major political movement articulating any sort of post-neoliberal ideology, right? The past is dead, but the future is not yet born, right? And we're sitting at this moment where we need a new way of approaching these problems, but nothing is really forthcoming. And this is what I tell my students, the things that I was taught when I was their age just are not true anymore, but no one has a solution right now. And anyone who's peddling a solution right now, people like your Donald Trumps and your populists, I won't get too blue, but they're not peddling the truth, right? They're peddling easy, simple answers for a world facing complex problems, right? Complex problems like climate change, complex problems like global inequality, complex problems like, intransigent racism and sexism. These are things that are deeply systemic, and they're not going to be changed by, Donald Trump saying he's going to close the border or, people saying that climate change doesn't exist. These are not solutions. But the solution, any sort of comprehensive solution, I haven't seen it yet. And I don't know what it looks like. And I don't think anyone really does, because we're at this moment in history where ideas are just not working anymore and no one seems to be able to articulate an alternative.
On the whole, what we have is a global youth that is increasingly divided and increasingly feeling like they don't have agency over their own futures. What needs to change?
What needs to change? Well, I mean, the first thing I will say is that younger people deserve a bigger slice of the pie, right? Not to be sort of overly controversial, but I don't think anyone should pay for university, right? I think university should be free to people who have, the right grades. They shouldn't have to pay for it, right? This is something that would take the burden of debt off of younger generations. It would cost society a lot, but, what are we doing here? What is society for? I think everyone should have access to education on principle, but even from an economic point of view, if you want a trained and skilled labor force, make sure that education is accessible. This is not a controversial point of view to have. Also, we need to make sure that young people have a pathway into secure jobs. The gig economy is terrible. Grind culture is terrible. No one should be worried about their next paycheck. We should provide people with stable income if they want it. Maybe you want to be a hustler. Maybe you do want to grind. Great. That's your choice. In my experience, the majority of people want to know where their next paycheck is coming. They want to make sure that they can pay rent. They want to make sure that when they want to, they can settle down and have a family. These are fundamental baseline things society should offer to young people. And young people should be asking for it. Young people should be demanding that they have these things. These are the things that were promised their parents and their grandparents. We are facing a generation with worse life chances than the one that came before it. And that is shocking, right? That hasn't happened for quite some time in the wealthiest part of the world. And young people should be absolutely livid about it. And they should be making their voices very, very much heard.
Dr. David Blunt, as a fellow millennial, I'm inclined to agree with you on that point. Thank you so much for joining us on the show.
My pleasure.
Those who were 18 years old when the GFC hit are now 34. By 2026, they'll be eligible voters who weren't even born when the Lehman Brothers collapsed. They've only ever known a world shaped by the economic fallout from the 2008 crash. Some movements have tapped into this growing frustration. Bernie Sanders' campaigns for the Democratic nomination in 2016 and 2020 resonated with young voters in the US, but he never advanced far enough to win. In the UK, Labour leader Jeremy Corbyn became a charismatic progressive voice, hitting the stage of Glastonbury and sparking a chant inspired by the White Stripes. But when it came time to vote in 2017, the youth vote only rose by 2.5%, falling well short of projections of a 16% surge. Sanders and Corbyn became emblematic of a wave that never crested in the West. Progressive idealists who could supposedly rally the youth. Instead, they were ultimately succeeded by more conservative institutionalists like Joe Biden and Keir Starmer, who won their respective elections. Now, the next youth movement seems to be coming from the other side of the political spectrum.
I think that he should go with J.D. Vance. He was a very young guy. He's 39 years old. He speaks to the discontent that millennials and Gen Z have to the boomers.
In France, for example, the attempted right-wing revolution against Emmanuel Macron almost tipped France's parliamentary elections upside down isn't over. And the French National Rally's 28-year-old leader Jordan Bardella is likely to remain at the centre of the conversation. At the European elections in June, 32% of French voters between 18 and 24 voted for Bardella and the National Rally, the right-wing, anti-immigration party we've learned about during this series. Bardella is young. He grew up in the tough northern Paris suburbs and has no formal academic qualifications beyond high school. Sociologist Laurent Ledoux notes the right's appeal lies in their representation of the most precarious, least educated, and often rural segments of society. Bardella and the National Rally have successfully positioned themselves as countercultural, despite advocating for policies reminiscent of a bygone France. The National Rally has laid a blueprint for right-wing movements the world over to channel the disenchantment of young people towards great political gain. In Australia's last federal election, support for the two major parties for people under 40 is at its lowest point since the 1930s. And in the US, before he dropped out of the race, early polling showed Joe Biden leading Trump by 8 percentage points among voters under 29, a sharp decline from the 23-point lead he held in the 2020 election.
At where young people are today relative to this point in the last cycle, they tell us they're less likely to vote because they're less likely to see the difference that government can make.
In the UK, just 52% of voters turned up to vote in this year's election, the lowest voter turnout since universal suffrage.
The reason why young people have fallen behind this country more than anything else is because they don't vote and old people do.
One thing is clear. Young people are dissatisfied with the way things stand, and they're ready for change. The big question is, will they throw their weight behind idealistic leaders promising to mend the political divide and heal decades of culture wars? Or will they be drawn to charismatic populists, eager to reshape the world in their own image? In any case, in 2024, we can expect to see the contours of a new political landscape taking shape sooner rather than later. That's the end of this series of Leave It to the Experts. We'll be back next week with some of the best of our special reports on the topics dominating our world, from global affairs to science and health. Our in-depth coverage continues at 360info.org. You can sign up for our newsletters and newswire for journalists and learn about our work with university experts worldwide to fight misinformation. This episode of Leave It to the Experts was produced by Michael Joyner, Reese Hooker and Lachlan Caselli. Music by Jan Skubashevsky at Red Moon Studios. Research by Amber Holton. I'm your host, Emma Hoy. See you next time.